Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Great Depression, Part 1. So, this is a class on the history of American sport and gaming, and it's important as we learn more about the kinds of sports that are growing and the culture of them, to also understand aspects of the wider world in which these are occurring and also the common experiences, that are happening in America at the time. And so this particular video and the next one that'll follow on really are kind of intended to give us kind of an overview of kind of the other aspects of the history that's going on so that we can see how sport is kind of enmeshing and immersing itself within the American experience within this period. All right. So we're going to talk about 5 terms that are important for us when thinking about this period. And so the first term for us is Treaty of Versailles. So 1918, World War I ends. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. Germany is forced to admit war guilt. They're supposed to pay reparations. You'd had a lot of economic upheaval, both in the U.S. and elsewhere as a result of the war. And you're going to see an economic downturn that's going to happen that will result in the Great Depression, where you will have a stock market crash that happens in the fall of 1929. Now that brings us to our second term, which is the crash. And what ends up happening is the stock market's protections that might exist today to kind of forestall something like this from occurring aren't there, right? And this was also an era in which, although very few Americans actually bought stock, those who did could buy it on credit. And of course, the idea of commercial lending operations connected to banks all over the country is pretty extensive. And so it had reverberating effects, where by the time you get to 1932, there's quite a sizable percentage of Americans that are either unemployed or underemployed and very little social safety net to be able to provide for them. That brings us, so we've got Versailles, we've got the crash. That brings us to Herbert Hoover. All right, so that's our next term, is Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. He was elected in 1928. And Herbert Hoover, when he was elected, was actually seen as quite an economic force. He's referred to, quote unquote, as the master of calamities, right? This guy who can handle really anything. He's someone, is either in the first or in one of the first graduating classes at Stanford University, makes his money through partly, in mining and management and things, but part of that has to do with racialization, which is, of course, not okay. But is involved in philanthropic efforts in World War I, and involved in the economy throughout the 1920s. This brings us to our next term, which is associationalism. So, if you grew up in the U.S. and you read a K through 12 textbook about this era, commonly they'll use they'll use a number of phrases like laissez-faire or hands off when it comes to Hoover and thinking about the government and the economy. The other real phrase that we need to sort of acknowledge is associationalism. So Hoover really thought that not only should the government not necessarily be involved in the economy to an extent, although he somewhat changes this as the Depression goes on. What he kind of thought was that private industries should be able to get together and provide for themselves. That they should be able to kind of form community and to be able to provide assistance for those who need it through these kinds of associations. This was the effort that Hoover was hopeful for, when it came to the economy. All right. That brings us to our fifth point, which is the 1932 election. So Spring of 1932, you have the Bonus March, which is this really horrible event, where you have starving veterans and their families who are in D.C. looking for, a bonus payment, and the army is called out on them, and violence is happening in the streets of D.C. It's really terrible. Hoover wins the nomination for the Republican Party, and he's going against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former governor of New York. What's interesting about Roosevelt is that he and the Democrats are able to kind of effectively tie much of this economic uncertainty and this horrific depression of at least a quarter of the country out of work, more than likely way more than that, and is able to argue that what the country needs is, kind of activism and, a way to kind of, I'm sort of paraphrasing from some scholars here, but to sort of, shore up the system, right? And what you end up with is kind of a coalition of individuals and communities that will end up voting for the Democrats overwhelmingly in 1932, and putting Roosevelt, putting President Roosevelt into electing him and to become president. So the 1932 election is really critical, because of the nature of this upheaval and all of this difficulty. Thank you very much.